Thanks. I think everyone's here, so we can maybe start with intros. Hi, everyone. I'm Vansh. Uh, I'll be your chair for the semifinals. Congratulations on reaching thus far and good luck for this debate. Judging alongside me are
Hi, I'm Changxiang. Good luck for the round.
I'm Gary. Good luck for the round.
great. Can all teams please drop in their speaker roles in chat? Meanwhile, we'll do a bunch of housekeeping. Do not exceed your time. Anything you say beyond 7:15 will not go down on our sheets. Secondly, please offer and take POIs. They are very important for engagement. If you do not take POIs, then that might be potentially decisive in flipping close comparisons. Just waiting on teams to drop in their speaker roles in chat, and then we'll start.
Hi. We are unable to type in the chat, so could our team just do verbal introductions?
Yeah, I think that should be okay.
Okay.
Okay, let's maybe go around the house, then doing verbal introductions, starting with OG.
Okay, so this is Caleb. He's doing PM. Hi, I'm Donovan. I'm doing DPM.
Okay, OO.
Um, Wait. Hello is Timothy.
I'm DLO, I'm Rafael.
Great. CG.
Hi, Michelle is doing member, and I'm Taoyu, I'm doing whip.
Great. And CO.
Jaden is member opposition. I'm with Jacob's.
Okay, perfect. I think we are good to start. Prime Minister, whenever.
Hi, can I check that I am audible and now visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Okay. Just a quick note, verbal POS only, I will not be reading the chat. Also for the sake of this recording, I want to note that none of whatever is said in this debate for myself and I guess other debaters, hopefully, is not representative of our actual views. So yeah, let's not get cancelled today. What? Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I want you to look at the world around you, and I want you to look again. And then go online and read the news and look about how the environment isn't actually what you think it is. The world isn't just fine and dandy, it's burning. And at the end of the day, what we need to realize is that we're cooked. We're cooked beyond salvation, and the only way to do this is prepare for ourselves at the time in which we are cooked. Let's do a few bits of framing here. What is climate conservation and what do its effects look like? We think these efforts look like the development of things like green tech, for instance, to try and reduce carbon emissions, attempts to also develop other forms of infrastructure to help to reduce like mitigate things like rising sea levels as well as melting polar ice caps, etc. All these sorts of things, right? What do apocalypse look like? We think this apocalypse looks like to the point at which your environment is being devastatingly destroyed. This looks like more and more wildlife species dying and going extinct or being declared extinct every single year and only being declared retroactively. It looks like flash floods in low-lying areas, which destroys massive amounts of housing and affecting massive amounts of poor people who can't even access their housing due to things like the capitalist system, for instance. It looks like torrential rainfall over areas, which causes massive amounts of flooding to destroy also infrastructure. And it finally looks like the washing off of surface runoff, and the extent of that looks like landslides, for instance, which just creates very sudden not only just flooding, but just destruction of villages, especially in very rural areas. What is the impact of this? The impact of this is to show you that actually the apocalypse technically is already happening, right? Where do we think the start of the apocalypse lies? We think this occurs on a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we think this occurs in some places where it's already going on for all the reasons that I've already listed to you, because these things are already happening. We've already seen it reported in the news. In other places, for instance, they are not relatively affected. So for instance, in Singapore, where we are, I guess, relatively fine, we're only like now starting to see the effects of increasing global temperatures because it's bloody hot, right? So this goes to show that if it looks like status quo, then we ought to already be prepared, but we can't. Green tech is already failing. why do current conservation efforts don't work? We think this boils down to the intrinsic features of green technology, where we have to acknowledge that yes, there are different kinds of technology which all focus on the same aim, which is to do things like lower carbon emissions to mitigate the extent of global warming. Here's the problem, and I think there's 4 structural reasons for this. Firstly, most green tech, if not all green tech, requires massive amounts of land and resources, and this is often unavailable to places like Singapore, for instance, with low hinterland and is very land scarce. In Singapore, we're unable to adopt things like wind turbines, like nuclear power plants, like geothermal energy, and these are the crucial things that has only popped up in the latest years, which has quote-unquote catalyzed the invention and the innovation of green technology. Insofar as that's the case, it means that many countries who should be using this green technology to help mitigate the effects of global warming just are structurally and systematically locked out of these technologies, which means that they are forced to go to other alternatives like fossil fuel, which I'll explain later. Secondly, it's just the environmental conditions as well, because it's not just limited to Singapore. Other countries, for instance, just don't have things like necessary wind, or just have very unsuitable environmental conditions like highlands, for instance, and no like arable land to even develop and place this technology in the first place. The third is the high opportunity cost that is incurred by this green technology, which necessarily leads to lots of destructive impacts, especially in green technologies that are in relatively nascent stages. This looks like, for instance, the invention of electric vehicles, which although may ostensibly seem to reduce carbon emissions on the individual level, it still increases it massively, insofar as you need to do extensive lithium mining in the seas of China to even craft these lithium batteries to get your EVs in the first place. It looks like, for instance, the impacts of water consumption on nuclear power plants, which massively heats up the surrounding area, destroying the wildlife that basically depends on these water sources to even survive and exist in these places in the first place. And here's the problem. We think that all of this is currently inefficient and it will never get efficient enough for a few reasons. Firstly, it's just too slow. The rate of innovation is vastly unachievable to even catch up to the rate at which global temperatures are just rising. We see every single year that global temperatures are rising beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius that the UN tried to market, because people just don't cooperate. And the fact is that because this is just insufficient, then it will never actually realize its fullest potential. Why do you think alternatives don't work? Because necessarily if green technology isn't enough, then the alternatives also lie down to things like fossil fuel, for instance, which we all know is necessarily a worse evil, right? But this is just some alternatives that some countries have to resort to because they don't even have access to this green technology in the first place. If opposition wants to argue that maybe green tech can accelerate its innovation, they have to structurally explain why and show you how it's able to catch up to things like the rate of global warming. We think it's fundamentally insufficient. The question we therefore ought to ask in this debate is why things will never get better. But before I move on to this, I'll take a point from CEO. Oh, great, that's my engagement. So why things will never get better? We think there's 2 structural reasons on this. Firstly, there is very little political incentive to even do so. Because note that the current state of politics within countries is that many fractionalized parties are just unwilling to cooperate and want to focus on every single other thing except for tackling climate change. Take, for instance, the US, where the dominance in politics lies in things like identity politics and racialized politics, as opposed to the increased presence within green politics. That's why the Green Party in USA, for instance, who's garnering for change no thank you, you missed your time, who's garnering for change within the environment, just simply doesn't get even a significant amount of vote share to have a say in parliament. They have like what, 1% of the vote share? Like, it's so insignificant. Secondly, people don't care because most people within developed countries are just not near enough and don't feel the proximate effects of global warming. Therefore, they are more concerned with other things, for instance. The third is just there's no international cooperation across the board, especially from major countries. Why is this the case? Because every single other country is only concerned about themselves or their own self-interest. Take, for instance, Russia, who's now, instead of fighting climate change, fighting Ukraine. Take, for instance, Iran and the whole Middle East, who instead of fighting climate change, fighting each other. You see how across the board, countries are just willing to go to war as opposed to willing to fight this bigger war. Therefore, we think if no one is willing to even tackle these efforts, and if efforts across the world are just not enough to amount to catching up to global warming, and we think, therefore, this world will never get better. This sets us on the route to being cooked. What do we think that preparation for apocalypse looks like? We think this looks like 2 things. Firstly, moving people out of affected areas. This is crucial because people who are most proximal to these effects need protection. You need to ensure that their right to life is protected. You need to ensure that the system who has failed them now cannot fail them. That's why we think, therefore, it's important to give them things like capital, for instance, to move out of affected areas. For instance, in places like Tuvalu, for instance, where rising sea levels have basically engulfed the entire country, governments have actually been able to move people out of Tuvalu and digitize their country to at least protect their heritage. But second and more importantly, is the creation of artificial habitats. This looks like governments may, for instance, create things like underground bunkers to protect people from, like, I don't know, rising sea levels or whatever. For all these reasons, we think, therefore, that preparation for apocalypse is important. We are cooked.
Thanks for that speech, Leader of Opposition.
Sorry, my DLO is like. Okay, give me a second. Hang on. Okay, hi. I'm back. My camera doesn't really work, so okay, hang on. POIs, just give it to me like verbally. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, preferably from closing for engagement. Okay. Cool. I'll start my speech soon. Okay. Yep. 3, 2, 1. I think immediately OG is out of this debate because they don't frame apocalypse properly. I think they try to give the very soft characterization about why apocalypse is likely to happen, why apocalypse is like things that we are already in. But I just like, logically, I just don't really buy this argument, right? Panel, listen to their language use. They give you examples like flash floods, they give you examples like landslides. But I mean, I don't take geography, but this clearly isn't an apocalypse, right? Flash floods happen because of climate change, which increases the intensity of rainfall. I don't need to know these things because I take geography, but just because I'm an average reasonable voter, right? Because of the intensity of rainfall, it probably means to say that there's flash floods coming in. I don't know the exact science behind this, but I mean, you can search it up if you don't believe me. But second thing on landslides, I just think insofar as we're talking about natural disasters that happen or like disasters that happen because of the climate, I think landslides is the first thing we point to in everyday lives. Things like deforestation, which reduces the land's ability to absorb water. I think because like all of these things that happen, it probably means that landslides happen because of a result of climate change, not because of an apocalypse. I think then the more charitable frame that the government benches ought to take is to adopt a few fold, right? The first is what does a more charitable apocalypse actually look like? This looks like the end of the road due to an asteroid, etc., or maybe a major volcano, and the list is non-exhaustive. What these events have in common is that they lead to large amounts of death, regardless of how prepared we are. I'll explain why this analysis is important later on. But I think the key thing to note here is that apocalypse is not happening now. I think an apocalypse is something that's unlikely to happen. I'll flesh this out later on. But I think the last most important thing is that an apocalypse does not happen in our everyday lives, which is why it's so unlikely to happen. I think this is the major pushback that OG just doesn't seem to respond to or preempt. Next thing, what does preparation of an apocalypse actually look like? This looks like spending money in bunkers. This looks like spending money on food reserves. Why then is an apocalypse unlikely to happen? This looks like a few fold. Number one, apocalypse happens once in a million years. Like, I'm not joking. Like, when the asteroids hit, that was millions of years ago. The last one we seen was the meteor hitting the dinosaurs centuries back. What this means is that, firstly, since apocalypse happens once every million years, it probably means that it's unlikely to happen, which probably means that all of our resources that we divert into the apocalypse is unlikely to be useful at all. But second thing is the fact that like they don't really even explain why is it the case that in this frame or in this world where we ought to have like justification for it, right? Because I think firstly the fact that their premise is already wrong, but the second thing is that there is no justification because of the fact that the public or there will be no good optics to actually support the funding of such apocalypse as my deputy will explain later on. But the second claim they tell you is a few things, right? The first is that climate conservation is ineffective. But panel, I just don't really think this claim wins because of the flip, right? I think if you're thinking about this logically, I think because it's so bad, we probably need to improve it. Because of the fact that it's ineffective now, we probably need to have more resources diverted into it, which probably means that there is justification for us like putting funding into it. But then OG tells us, well, no, because it's hard to improve it, because it's too slow and there's little opportunity cost. A few things to note here. I think generally there's a global trend shifting towards like being conscious about the environment. I think countries are generally becoming more aware of climate issues. I think there's generally more public education towards inculcating the young with values about why the climate is important. I think there's general support for climate funding, which means that in the long term, there's likely going to be a trend where climate technologies improve. But the second thing, they tell you, well, climate conservation doesn't work in certain areas, and then therefore, like, we shouldn't fund this. I don't really see how this makes sense. The first is the fact that the areas that they tell you are very geographically small, which means to say that even insofar as we take their best case where climate conservation doesn't work, it still doesn't really make sense, because it doesn't mean that we ought not to have it, because climate change is a consensus issue. I think insofar as we have the big major countries like the US or China actually adopting more like green technologies, I think that's a good thing on net. But also, because some regions face unavoidable climate harms, conservation now becomes more important globally, not less. If vulnerable countries can't adopt or mitigate on their own, the worst thing we can do is remove global conservation support, because now they're cooked, because now low-lying coastal areas will be cooked, because now low-lying coastal areas will be submerged. I think insofar as they want to talk about small countries, we win on that as well. Next, what would our content policy then look like? I think this looks like a few things later on. This looks like a few things. The first is continued climate conservation, i.e. things like investments in green technology, climate resilient infrastructure, R&D into green technologies like the advancements of making solar panels more energy efficient. Second thing, I think on the societal level, this also looks like continued international cooperation to reduce carbon emissions, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which includes policies like the Paris Agreement, which aims to reduce global temperatures. But the third thing, I think, is crisis response systems to things like heat waves, floods, or storms, or like OG points out, landslides. I think this is the cases where it actually it applies to our context more. I think uniquely the burden that government has to take on it is that they must stop all funding and plans, which means that there are no efforts to conserve the climate at all. I don't think OG has done the sufficient legwork to prove why they necessarily take on this burden, right? I'll now explain why funding to climate conservation is important, but before I move on, I'll take from closing. No? Opening?
The problem here is that you impose a burden on yourself to explain how exactly you increase the vast amount of money investment into tech that you yourself require.
Okay, well, I explained it just now, but I think the important thing to note here is number one, I'll repeat what I said, right? Number one is the fact that people generally like the fact that we are surviving. Like, people understand that, hey, you know what, if we don't do shit about it, we're probably going to die, right? Which probably means that there's going to be decent public support for funding. This proves like the pool of funds that you have access to. But secondly, I think there's a global trend. Countries are generally becoming more aware of climate issues. You look at this like international cooperation frameworks that actually like pour in billions of dollars into climate conservation, right? Next, why is funding to climate conservation then important? I think the framing here is simple. Number one, climate change is irreversible. Panel, recognize that in the current global climate, we are at the point of irreversibility. This is important because at this current moment is the tipping point of where real tangible changes to the environment can be made, and we can still do something about it. Understand that this does two things. The first is that it creates urgency. We need to do something now before it's too late. Number two is justification for funding and plans to conserve the climate, because this is a consensus issue. Why is this the case? Twofold. A, climate change is causing super duper loads of harm. This looks like wildfires in Australia that causes respiratory issues. This looks like extreme heat waves that literally kill people of heat stroke. I think on an economic scale, entire economic sectors collapse without climate mitigation. This looks like crop failures that ruin the agricultural yield of farmers in the area due to unpredictable rainfall, droughts, heat stress, etc. Panel, this is especially important in lesser developed countries that rely on things like crop yields for their main economic output and stuff like that. I think the comparative then is very simple. Panel, I want to do some very quick weighing before my speech is up, right? Which is definite impacts versus speculative ones. We don't know if the apocalypse is going to happen. We don't know if any of our resources that we pump into it will actually work. On OG's best case, where all of their mitigation works, at least we can slow down climate change. At least we can slow down our doomsday. At least we can have some support towards climate conservation. And we say that even if we prove insofar as it somewhat works, I think we win this debate. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech, TPM.
Can I be seen and heard?
Yeah.
I'll take my POIs verbally. Yeah, so just unmute and ask. As we speak, thousands more die at the hands of an invisible enemy. The problem in this debate is recognizing the boundaries of which we are able to attain relevant tech for climate conservation and drawing the line of the point of no return and discussing whether or not we have crossed it. The problem with the OO case is twofold. The first is that they don't actually achieve the burden that they set out. They need to prove structurally why exactly they are able to attain the levels of funding and tech development that they require for their case to succeed. Note, the extent of their analysis is, well, this is a consensus issue, so surely we are going to be able to develop this tech. This is an appeal to intuition that rests on zero structural analysis. You need to explain why, even if it is true that people generally recognize the issue to exist, how this then translates into things like votes or campaigning or development. Caleb gives you structural reasons why it is unlikely that this is ever going to reach the critical stage where we are able to retrograde things that currently occur. I'll get into that later on. More importantly. So, as a result, I want to talk about three simple things. The first is about apocalypse. Are the horsemen coming? Second, is salvation possible? Are we able to go, are we either at the point of no return or headed or whatever the point may be? And third, about apocalypse prep, what this looks like, and what OO says we're unable to get funding for, which is just deeply confusing. First, are the horsemen coming? I want to note, their definition of an apocalypse is equally nebulous. They say random instances of things like volcanoes erupting or meteor striking. Like, I'm sure the debate is not about whether or not the aliens are coming. The question is about mass events that, in the case where you want to use the term exodus, result in the vast scale of death and destruction present in the world. If landslides and massive forest fires, people dying at the hands of things like floods caused by hydroelectric dam malfunctions, or the fact that animals have to directly suffer at the hands of the machines that we built is not an example already of the apocalypse. I'm just not sure what is. They're debating about the
You
cause
are-
of what is currently happening. The fact is that the result of climate change is very much death and destruction that we both teams in this debate do not want. Before I move on, I'll take the point.
I think in my speech, I already characterized things like flash floods or landslides as things that are generally issues with the environment or climate in specific. Why is it the case that this is not true?
No, I agree, it's true. It is a climate apocalypse. That was Caleb's speech. Okay, so as a result, the horsemen are likely to come. The apocalypse is going to occur, or it has already occurred in areas where we recognize the countries are directly suffering at the hands of it. Rising flooding levels that actively destroy infrastructure. The flash floods that you talk about destroying low-lying areas, devastating families, and killing breadwinners. The second question here I want to ask is whether salvation is possible. And look, this is the bulk of the material that they do not prove, because Caleb explains why, as he says, we are cooked. OO says that they will increase funding into these areas, but there are three problems with this. And these are the three structural reasons that Caleb provides. First, on the individual intrinsic characteristics of the technology, Caleb explains that different types of technology often are only applicable to different types of geographies. The fact, for instance, that each individual country can only use a specific type of tech suggests that it's very difficult to get international cooperation or pooling of funds to any specific one. It means that you're unable to do things like manage your consistent investments across the board of development of this tech, because each country has to do it individually, autonomously, based on their individual circumstances. He explains to you about the political incentives. And note, OO's only response is to counter-assert that they have some form of desire and consensus. But what does this look like? Even if, okay, firstly, this is not true. Presently, individuals recognize their most proximate issues to the ones they care about the most. Even if we accept that individuals care to some extent about the environment, this is weighed against the more proximate issues, for example, the economy, that ends up swaying elections. But third, even if we take this at their very best and say that at some point in time, no thank you, this statement was factually correct, it is no longer the case. As we've observed, individuals like under Trump's government or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, the rise in racialized politics on the right and the rise in identity politics on the left has drawn funding away from green parties or green movements, because that is simply not the battleground upon which elections are now fought. So even if, yes, people care about this, they do not vote the way in which they desire. Thirdly, then, on the geopolitics, what we explain is that it is very difficult to garner the support on a global scale to fight this global problem. Presently, smaller nations bear a disproportionately small amount of power over global decisions. It's precisely why, in the face of the low-lying countries suffering at the hands of flooding, you literally have countries like Brazil selling off parts of the rainforest to MNCs for trees to be deforested and emissions to skyrocket. The outcome of this is very important. Firstly, because it suggests that the extent to which we are able to retrograde existing destruction to the climate is at a point in which this opposition bench will no longer be able to meet. But secondly, even if you want to talk about instances specifically of the apocalypse described, so let's say nuclear war is coming. Why is it that this is far more likely than their alternative of developing? Firstly, because we are currently in that kind of political climate. Countries are worrying, right? We're teetering on the edge of immense destruction. Even if you don't buy the analysis that World War III is likely to result, and therefore we should very much be worrying about the bunkers that we have not yet built. The weighing here is quite simple. Their argument relies on unproven appeals to knowability. Their claim is that their outcomes are far more knowable than ours. This is not true. We explained that even if they manage to appeal to the infinite future people, and this is taking them at their most charitable on the utilitarian grounds that they do not explain. The problem here is that the outcome to them is unattainable, even if we recognize it to be important. What is attainable is a direct impact on individuals existing now, generations of individuals that will immediately be impacted in the case of ongoing death and destruction. And to those people, we owe the outsized duty. It is for those people we know that we can immediately protect. The last thing I want to talk about is apocalypse prep. Notably, OO says that we are unable to get funding on our side of the house. This is very strange.
COPOY last chance.
No, I accepted one prior. The problem here is that they don't explain why we won't get funding. Even if we ignore the potential like fiat afforded via this House would motion, the problem here is that they themselves concede that individuals want or know about the problems that currently exist. If you know that you might potentially be suffering at the hands of your house being destroyed by massive torrential rain, I'm not sure why you would not want to have money given to you by the government to flee from the area currently with torrential rain. The problem here is that the nature of the investments on the other side of the house have a long gestation period that draws away from the political capital that they rest their case implicitly upon. As a result, the counterfactual on our side of the house is far more attainable. The mechanism by which our case relies has a much lower burden of proof because by their own analysis, individuals are far more proximate to the issues that exist on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to attempts at fighting an invisible enemy. For all these reasons, I beg you to propose.
Thanks. That speech invite in dialogue.
Can I check that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Am I visible? Wait, my camera's not working. Can you give me a second? Okay, am I visible now?
Yeah.
Alright, cool. Um, Wait, can you? Okay, cool. Wait, let me come back. Oh, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. OG says we have to prove why we are likely to get funding. But panel, please note here, this has already been replied by my LO. Countries already invest in climate conservation because it is self-interested. It protects their economy, food stability, infrastructure, and public safety. This is literally the PM's own characterization of countries being selfish. We flip this on them by saying that it is exactly because they're selfish, they'll fund climate conservation because it severely affects their own country. Let me give the comparative on our side of the house. Governments fund conservation because it yields certain immediate benefits. Firstly, fewer disasters. Second, lower rebuilding costs. Third, more stable agriculture. Fourthly, safer infrastructure. In their world, they ask governments to defund conservation for a hypothetical apocalypse with no defined timeline. When voters, markets, and governments weigh that up, our world is the only one where the funding continues because the harms are guaranteed and visible. That comparative alone wins us the debate. OG then says, oh, they get the funding. Wait, okay. Now I want to take down that frame. PM comes out and tells us a few things. Firstly, they tell us that the climate is cooked and it is beyond salvation. Panel, I want to tell you that it is because of themes like OG that is why the climate is truly cooked. We need to recognize that we're slowly improving the climate bit by bit, whether it's visible or not. Over the last decade, there has been a drastic increase in environmental preservation efforts. As a matter of fact, the climate is improving. The ozone layer is slowly recovering. The climate is not beyond salvation. It just needs that monetary push, which OG prevents us from getting to take this climate conservation and then to the next level. This will work because there is already a huge buy-in on green technology. And secondly, the people want it. They have a weird idea about how we are not proximate to issues by the climate, and I'll take that down later. Secondly, there is already an extensive research on green technology, but what we actually need is just the money to go actualize it. The next thing they tell us is that next I want to clear up is what is an apocalypse. Firstly, I'll tell you that apocalypse are world-ending events. They're not the natural disasters that for some reason OG seems to frame. Even if we take their characterization for it, and apocalyptic measures, their apocalyptic preventive measures are usually insufficient. Let me explain to you why. Firstly, let's hear about what they just solely consider as apocalyptic measures. They tell us that, oh, we're going to move people out of these areas. Secondly, we're going to move people into bunkers. Why is this then insufficient? We need to think about, let's say, on the note that these apocalyptic events do happen, the timeline that it happens is actually super fast. We do not have enough sufficient time to actually move people out of these areas. And what does this analysis then mean? The death toll is usually so much in these apocalyptic events, and it is because apocalyptic events are so disruptive, these measures just won't suffice. And even if it does, the quality of life of the people that are surviving in these bunkers just won't be good enough. And in fact, as a matter of fact, a lot of the time, people would just rather be dead. The next thing I want to talk about is why they are framed of the whole idea of why their whole defense mechanism on why it's true that countries do not care about the climate is for some reason that countries go to war. That's why they do not care about climate change. But why can't I tell you that two things exist at the same time? Because countries have different agendas within that one nation. A country, yes, might want to be able to go to war because they have to defend themselves to protect the climate. Now okay, right, I'll talk about the proximity of climate. No, thank you. I'll talk about the proximity of climate later on. Now, okay, but before that, sure, I'll take a point from closing. Opening.
The burden of proof on OO is not to explain improvements can happen. You need to explain why we have not or will not cross the point of no return.
Because I already explained to you, the climate is already improving. We just need the monetary push to actually continue to let it improve. I don't understand why your framing makes it sound like the climate is like dying and the only thing that's going to happen is the apocalypse. And even if so, that the only thing that does actually happen is the apocalypse. I'm unclear why your preventive measures are actually sufficient to ensure the quality of life or even the life at all of the people that's existing within the apocalypse itself. Now I want to talk about allocative efficiency of spending of money. What we need to recognize is that firstly, whether we spend money on apocalypse or climate conservation, the funding comes from the taxpayers' money. Why is this characterization then important? This is because taxpayers and citizens will generally want their money being spent on issues that are more proximate to them. And this will further explain why this proximity issue does exist. We can take a look at things like we can take a look at things like what people ask for, right? People ask for better housing, people ask for better healthcare. What does this then mean? This means that people will want the money to be spent on issues that they can feel. Why is then the issue of this climate then proximate to people? This is because we can instantly just feel the impact of it. I bet you money that OG has complained about the rising temperatures of Singapore, and they still dare tell me that they can't feel the increase of temperature. That analysis just doesn't make sense to me. We can feel the increase of global temperatures. People are constantly getting displaced out of their homes due to rising sea levels. The conclusion of this analysis is that people are constantly getting affected by these issues. Now the question is that why does the people's voices are then important? Because these are people who vote for the government so that they will want change that matters. And let me tell you that what people do not actually care about is the apocalypse, right? So even if I want to buy their proximate framing, right? How on earth is the idea of the apocalypse any proximate to the civilians today? Why is that the case, right? Since young, we have been taught that apocalyptic events happens once in a million years. Let's think about it. My teacher taught me the extinction of the dinosaurs happened millions of years ago, and that was framed as an apocalyptic event, by the way, not a natural disaster. And we haven't heard of one since, right? Since young, we have been programmed to think and understand that apocalypse won't happen anytime soon. Hence, there is no incentive to care. Then what is Timothy's contribution to this debate then? A few things. Firstly, it pushes Prop's case into a low probability tale that suggests that it is less urgent and less socially relevant, putting our case above OG. Second, we reduce the economic impacts to agricultural sectors in less developed countries. Panel, even if you don't buy the fact that our version of climate change isn't very extreme, you will believe that it doesn't have to be. In Cambodia, when temperatures rose by 0.2 degrees Celsius, it already incurred massive damages to farmers in the area because crop temperatures are already very sensitive. This is important because it lowers the burden that us OO have to take. We do not need to prove why climate change is super bad. We only need to prove to you mechanically why funding is likely to improve climate change, which I already did in my speech. Now I'll do the weighing on why we beat out OO and why we beat out OG and why we beat out the rest of the teams, right? This is because we give you firstly impact. We tell you that these climate events are most likely to happen. People will feel most proximal to them. Hence, the impact is when we spend more money on climate efforts, the impact is immediate. But however, on the government side of the bench, recognize that they're prepping for something that is long term. So the funding will have to go into it for millions and millions of years, right? And the worst part is you will not actually see, you might not even see an actualized outcome. Never be more proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech. That concludes top half. Inviting member of Gov to start back half.
Hi, can I check that I'm clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Opening half has brought themselves into a deadlock between whether climate conservation is effective and when will the apocalypse happen. We bring to you a deadlock breaker, okay? Let's be the most charitable team in this debate, and we will assume that in opposition's best case, an apocalypse isn't happening yet. But we will now prove why we still win this clash, well, later on in my speech. And our unique selling point on our side is that we prove comparatively increasing preparedness against an apocalypse is likely to be effective. And why do we say this is a unique selling point? OG only proved why climate conservation is ineffective. Yes, but not why our side does anything better in protecting the earth in general. A few rebuttals for the House today. OO comes up and tells us that we are already at the tipping point. We can do something now before it's too late. Firstly, this is not true. The tipping point is not reversible. The ship has sailed and it's not going to come back. No amount of funding or no amount of monetary push can cause glaciers to unmelt or cause the ocean to deacidify. It cannot bring back climate beneficial animal species from extinction. OO comes out and asserts that yes, we can reverse climate change with funding, but they don't give any structural reasons why this is factually true. Two, even if we take them on their best case and assume that from now, climate conservation will be effective at best, we already exist in the damaged world that we live in now, right? Therefore, we call out OO for this severe timeline mismatch. Even if we assume then that we can do something at this point in time, throughout OO, it is evident that the end goal is to maintain survival of the Earth and humans living on the Earth. And I'm sure this is something that all teams can agree on. But OO then completely avoids their burden to prove that when an apocalypse happens, protecting the environment would allow humanity to stay alive. And the fatal flaw on OO is that they keep taking government on their worst case. They assume that A, the so-called monetary push can reverse climate change, and B, the apocalypse will never happen. And the impact of this is that since they failed to defend either claim, their case falls. 2. OO comes out and hinges their entire case on the premise that the apocalypse only would happen once every million years on an uncertainty. But we don't get any structural reason other than conspiracy theories about aliens, and this is problematic because without this premise, they cannot prove any of their argument or even about being at the tipping point. Now on to my positive material. I'll bring you this in 3 ways. 1, I will prove why even on opposition's best case, even when an apocalypse isn't happening and conservation works, we still win this clash. 2, I will prove why increasing preparedness for an apocalypse would benefit humankind, which is a huge gap, by the way. And 3, I will prove the state's obligation towards citizens in this debate. 1, we tell you that opening half has brought themselves into a deadlock, and now I'll prove to you why we still win this clash. Even in the best case, climate conservation is only going to delay the apocalypse, but you cannot delay it forever. Climate effects compound over time. We have already historically caused such large-scale emissions that no amount of climate conservation can reverse every bit of pollution produced since the industrial period. But even if climate conservation works, mankind will simultaneously be polluting the environment not at this time because our survival depends on resource exhaustion. Plastic, water, releasing chemicals during the manufacturing process, these things won't go away anytime soon because our lives are so dependent on these resources. And even if we use green technology, it's not the case. This means that on net, climate conservation can only at best lower the net damage to the environment. But since people actively harm the environment for an unlimited period of time, as far as our lifespan, but funding is so limited, an apocalypse will happen anyway. So you might be able to delay the apocalypse for 10 years, but after 10 years, your cumulative pollution could outweigh the efforts to reverse climate change. 2, I'll now prove to you why increasing preparedness for an apocalypse would benefit humankind. Judge, this is a huge gap in the OG case. They proved to you that climate conservation is ineffective, but not why comparatively increasing preparedness is likely to be effective, and we build this gap. 1. Increasing preparedness for an apocalypse could look like A. History has proven that cautionary measures increases survival. So for example, we take you to examples like the COVID pandemic where people stockpile medical supplies, have early response systems or save more lives, or the Cold War period where countries built bomb shelters, or natural disasters where countries like Japan reinforce their infrastructure and have evacuation plans or routes for their citizens. This has proved time and time again to minimize the scale of collateral damage. So this is how increasing preparedness looks like. And we say that this preparedness raises the odds of survival. If the probability of surviving an extreme event is near zero without preparation because you have nowhere at all to run or hide, you don't have enough food to sustain you throughout the catastrophe, if you don't even have enough clean air to breathe, then preparation at least increases your capacity to maintain the basic necessities of food, shelter, and stability. Because the government can now evacuate people who live near coastal areas to prevent them from being killed. They can at least give people a decent shelter, clean air to breathe, clean air to respire. So at least you risk less things, and at least you increase your chance of survival since you have nothing to lose at all without preparedness. Preparedness also means that we preserve resources. For example, strengthening supply chains, building infrastructure that can withstand severe earthquakes, or creating emergency communication systems. And all this helps to maintain order and reduce casualties. So I've proved to you this gap that OG left. Last thing I'll prove to you. The state has an obligation towards its citizens. The state obligation is inherently relevant to this debate because from the wording of this motion, from the wording of the words funding of and plans for, implies the existence of a governing body. Because in the vast majority of cases, only state governments have the most capacity to fund large-scale green projects and do planning for such projects. And I'll prove to you that governments have a greater moral obligation towards citizens over the environment in 3 structural reasons. 1, citizens come logically prior to the environment. Humans are the only people that can protect the environment. For example, by environmental agreements, laws to prevent deforestation, using taxpayers' money to generate this funding in the first place. And if humans cannot even survive the apocalypse, we have already proved it's likely to happen before saving the world on the government bench, then there is no one else to protect the environment, and we lose both the environment and the existence of humankind. 2, citizens are the only creatures with the consciousness, agency, and capacity for suffering. Plants don't feel capacity for pain if they starve or drown, right? Therefore, the interests of humans matter in a much more immediate and direct way. This means that our greatest moral obligation is towards preventing human death and suffering on a massive scale. Lastly, the state's duties lie in the moral contract between humans and the government. We say that governments are likely to be the primary stakeholder in this debate, and since people contribute to the social, economic, and moral ecosystem, but the climate does not. The state therefore owes greater reciprocal obligations to protect people. Therefore, citizens are the only people that actively sustain the state and the existence of humankind. And if the end goal of saving the environment is to make it a habitable living space, then citizens should come before the environment. For these reasons, OG, thank you. CD.
Thanks for that speech, inviting member of OP.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll take verbal POIs, please. I won't be looking at the chat. I'll start in 3, 2, One, CG is correct. At this point in the debate, I am still unsure about whether or not the climate is cooked. CO will sidestep the opening battle of whether or not apocalypse is solvable or possible to solve, and forward two arguments. Firstly, on regardless of whether we solve climate change, trying to solve climate change is a good thing. And secondly, we will complete the DLO one-liner and explain why it is better to die than to live in a post-apocalyptic world. First extension. And this thesis of this extension is that the process of trying to solve climate change yields a lot of positive externalities in other aspects of society that are not contingent on actually solving the main problem of climate change. And this comes in 5 ways. Firstly, things like renewable energy is useful for our everyday lives. Insofar as fossil fuels are quickly running out, we need the process of renewable energy to continue fueling our lives and continue fueling industries and the economy in status quo. Secondly, efforts to reduce pollution, like to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide or other chemicals in air, also has a lot of health benefits and health side effects to humans insofar as we can breathe cleaner air and have a better standard of living in our daily lives. Thirdly, things like green industries, the development of EVs and like all of these new industries means that there's more economic growth across the world. It gives more people jobs and higher wages. Fourthly, things like planting trees to absorb carbon dioxide also increases the quality of life of people in urban centers insofar as they have more parks to enjoy, more greenery to enjoy. And lastly, we also have a principled obligation to animals to try to solve climate change, because notice, climate change is a result of human activity. And if an apocalypse happens as a result of it, it will also harm the trillions of livestock, insects, birds, and sea animals in the world who can also feel pain and who are also sentient. We say that humanity has a responsibility to try to reverse climate change as a reparatory obligation to them to stop the harm, or at least try to reverse the harm that we have caused and will affect these animals who are innocent and don't deserve to suffer from this harm. But crucially, notice, the reason why we have all of these good things like economic growth, clean air, renewable energy is because, one, a large section of the population cares about solving climate change and hence push for these things. But secondly, rich people also want to solve climate change insofar as they want to avoid dying, and hence they lobby or invest in those things themselves. At the point where you give up on solving climate change, at the point where you commit everything to solving the apocalypse, you take funding, you take resources away from all these positive externality yielding activities, and you put them into something that the benefits are only far into the future. That means people right now don't get to enjoy them. Why then is this an important extension? Because given that all teams implicitly agree that any potential apocalypse is still a substantial amount of time away, the most certain impact then in this debate is the improvement of the lives of people before the apocalypse happens, i.e. in the 10 or 20 or 30 years before the apocalypse. All these things mean that people can live happier, better lives before the apocalypse, and we think that's already a net utility gain on our side. Before I move on to my second extension, I'll take that POI.
So the structural reasons we give and things like political myopia cap the gestation period for your own tech development. You've sidestepped off the edge of a cliff.
No, because all of these things are already existing. These are all short-term activities that we can get now if we just invest in climate change now. Like, I'm not sure how long it takes to just implement renewable energies insofar as we have that already, right? So I don't think your framing is true. Second extension, we say that life after the apocalypse is not worth living at all. And here I want to note that the extent of both Gov teams' analysis is that the apocalypse is inevitable and that we should focus on surviving the apocalypse. We will prove that surviving the apocalypse is a bad outcome that is going to cause a lot of suffering for 6 structural reasons. Firstly, there's going to be wars for resources. And here I want to note that we depend on many resources, natural resources like drinkable water, land, raw materials to survive. And notice that when an apocalypse happens, it will render a lot of those resources unusable. Hence, at this point, differing factions or the countries that emerge from the apocalypse will be forced to fight each other for what is left. They have to fight for the remaining resources in order to ensure their own survival. And this will cause a lot of deaths. This will cause a lot of casualties. And I want to note, this conflict will be especially bloody and especially intense, because now people are fighting for their very survival. It isn't a fight out of ideologies like nationalism or a fight to gain more territories. It's a fight to ensure that you yourself can continue having the food and water and resources to live the next day. We say this fight is going to cause a lot of people to die in very painful ways, and this is bad. Secondly, people are likely to live under authoritarianism in a post-apocalyptic world for 2 reasons. Firstly, in times of chaos, i.e. after an apocalypse, people want to feel secure. They gain that sense of security by gravitating towards strongman figures and those who project power. So it is unlikely to be a democratic process. It's probably going to be who has the most power, who has the most firearms in the aftermath. That is who's going to take control. B, any form of authority that asserts itself post the apocalypse has to be authoritarian, because when resources are limited and heavily rationed and any mistake can cause the whole colony, the whole bunker to run out of food, any form of dissidence and instability is deadly. It threatens everyone's survival. Hence, you need to have a system of extreme authoritarianism, an extreme control to ensure that everyone continues living and like you continue like chugging along like this like subsistence path. Thirdly, we say and like just authoritarian. Of course, we shouldn't want to live in an authoritarian regime. That means like things like civil liberty, self-expression are stripped away, and like obviously those are important to humanity. And if we don't have it, that makes people sad. Thirdly, it also invalidates a lot of religion, because we say a fundamental part of many religions, like the Abrahamic ones, is an apocalypse is the will of God to take them to heaven. But when the apocalypse happens, but people don't get taken to heaven, they just survive in their like tiny bunker. That means they will have huge cognitive dissonance insofar as the fundamental part of their primary belief system has been destroyed. I'm a Christian. Why have I not been raptured to heaven? Why am I still in this bunker? And we say this will make people suffer insofar as something that they have been holding dear for the entirety of their lives have been stripped away. Fourthly, we say that people lose any sense of meaning in their lives, because notice that many occupations like middle managers, salesmen, finance workers, all of this becomes worthless once humanity has reverted to a state of survival. Insofar as people base a lot of their identity and value off of the work they do, this means billions lose a source of fulfillment and self-actualization. Fifthly, notice people will lead lives of subsistence in those bunkers. The limited resources means your priority at any given moment is to gather enough daily necessities, is to scrounge to get by to the next day. That means you have no more time, no more energy for self-actualization through things like hobbies. But lastly, because of human psychology, we base our happiness on constant comparison. We compare our current state to our past experiences. Even if you lead a decent life in the bunker, i.e. you have enough to drink and eat to the next day, you are still extremely unhappy because you have memories and experiences of the life you led before the apocalypse. You will feel depressed because it's a worse life than the one you had ever lived previously. What then is the implication of this extension? This deals with the entirety of OG and CG actually, because we prove that if an apocalypse does happen, we shouldn't want to survive it. We say that surviving it will lead to this state of authoritarianism where people are just scrounging to the next day, where all their sources of meaning have been robbed from them. We say it is preferable to go out instantly because of an asteroid as opposed to living in this world of like post-apocalyptic like dystopia. For all those reasons, CO.
Thanks for that speech and writing Cup Whip.
Hello, can I check that I'm clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Judge, I'm sure by now you're very confused about the state of this debate. In my speech, I'll go through why both op benches lose this debate by taking down their biggest attacks, and then I'll weigh our own extensions over every other team, including that of OG. So first then, let's analyze OO's contributions. They have two very big claims, one on uncertainty of this apocalypse happening in the first place, and second on the allocation of funding where voters want money to be spent on issues that are proximate. First on uncertainty then, two responses. First, we've already told you in Michelle's speech that the effects of climate change have already accrued. Look at the wildfires in Los Angeles last year and the increasing violence of hurricanes and typhoons in recent years. But secondly, let's take opposition bench at their best case and assume that, okay, maybe an apocalypse happening is uncertain. Here's how we flip uncertainty. Uncertainty only increases our obligation to prepare for this event. If we knew for sure, like 100%, that the apocalypse wouldn't happen, sure. But opposition themselves, in their own speeches, have admitted that there is still a probability, however low it is, there is still a chance that apocalypse will happen. Given our structural reasons as to why apocalypse happening is likely, this means that opposition runs the risk of irreversible large-scale casualties. In the case where they are significantly unprepared, even if there is low probability, governments in the status quo already routinely prepare for low probability, high impact events. We bring you analogies, for example. We spend massive amounts of our budget annually on our military every year, even if we're unlikely to be involved in conflict anytime soon in the next 10 years, because we'd rather be safe than sorry. We cannot take our citizens' lives unseriously. We spend lots of money on nuclear deterrence, on protecting ourselves from terrorism, for example, because the consequences of falling prey to such events are enormous. We would rather be prepared than take the consequences.
Opening.
Next, let's analyze opening's claim on the allocation of funding, where voters want money to be spent on issues that are more proximate to them, and hence they will not support things like building these bunkers or preparing themselves. Two responses again. First, the problem right now is that voters cannot evaluate risk properly. They have limited information because they aren't climate scientists. They have limited time to read up on these things. This means that voters on your side only deprioritize preparedness
opening.
because the government has failed to tell its citizens how urgent the apocalypse is, because governments have underinvested in explaining it. Once people understand the stakes, that is when we get critical support. We, uniquely on-site government, are better able to communicate the urgency of an apocalypse only when we don't continue with climate conservation, because these two things are mutually exclusive. If we continue to fund climate conservation, people will think that we can still save the environment to an extent, and they won't think an apocalypse is urgent. But we have already told you in our members' speech that the ship has sailed, and this is flawed thinking because we are currently in an apocalypse.
Opening.
Even if we are in like mass-scale catastrophic event, we think that it will happen sooner than we can prevent effectively using climate change conservation, as we explained in our member speech. But second response, increasing preparedness, in fact, doesn't consume as many resources as you might think. Preparing ourselves isn't always about building billion-dollar bunkers everywhere, for example. It's about things like setting up communication systems or evacuation routes, stockpiling resources so that you are prepared to survive and sustain yourself throughout the apocalyptic period. These are low cost compared to large infrastructure or large climate conservation projects that OG themselves already explained. They told you that you need a lot of investment into green technology. They told you need a lot of land, you need you need rivers to build hydroelectric dams in the first place, but a lot of countries don't have these resources. A lot of the developing countries that owe themselves
opening.
lack the resources to protect themselves in the first place if they want to fund these climate conservation projects. Because they lose out on this, we flip the claim on allocation of funding, where funding is much more expensive and it yields low returns on their side in the first place. But secondly, then, marginal investments yield high returns. Even a few thousand or $1 million spent on early warning systems or evacuating your citizens prevents billions in damage during your crisis. We would rather spend money to ensure our citizens remain alive than lose millions of our fellow people.
Opening.
Next, I'll move on to analyzing CO. They give us a really, really unreasonable and mind-blowing claim here, right? They say that, whoa, the post-apocalyptic world is uninhabitable for two main reasons. I know they had six, but they had two stronger ones that I'll respond to. First, they tell us that, their biggest claim is that they have no more resources in a post-apocalyptic world, right? You have no more food, you have no more water, you cannot survive after the apocalypse. But, I find this absurd because preparing yourselves ensures that we still have resources. Isn't that the entire point of increasing your preparedness for the apocalypse? You don't only evacuate systems, right? You stockpile your resources. For example, in the COVID-19 pandemic, although it wasn't a full-on apocalypse, it was still a catastrophic event because it stopped a lot of our normal routines. It impeded our normal routine. So it disrupted our daily lives so much. But it was a good thing that we were able to combat the pandemic because governments had already stockpiled medical resources, as we told you in our member speech. Because they were better prepared to deal with the pandemic in the first place, we were better to pull out of that period of time. So preparing yourselves on our side ensures that we still have the resources to sustain ourselves even in a post-apocalyptic world. This deals with the bulk of their claim that the post-apocalypse world is uninhabitable. But second, then, they have another unreasonable claim on authoritarianism. 3 lines of response. First, if we assume that resources are scarce, we take them at their best, let's assume that whatever they're saying about resource scarcity is true, we think that it is more likely that people will still want to collaborate on their side to increase the rate of survival. Because if you continue to squabble a bit amongst yourselves, we give you the analogy of political infighting. Within a party, if you fight internally with your fellow politicians, this impedes your efficiency and your competency as leaders. This obviously doesn't make sense, so people will still want to collaborate on their side. They want to share resources because they don't want to squabble over resources and risk themselves having no more resources on their side. But secondly, if authoritarianism still occurs, it will only happen in the short term because once the apocalypse is over, citizens have time to digest and recover from this period of time. They will then return to democracy. We would rather people survive and maybe stay in this world for a short period of time than they completely die in the first place. But now, lastly on weighing, why does our material weigh over everyone else? First, how does our 2 extensions weigh over OG? We proved to you in our member speech that there's a huge gap in the OG case. They only prove that climate conservation is going to be ineffective, but they don't prove the comparative. They don't build on how, comparatively, increasing your preparedness is likely to be effective and how it's likely to sustain ourselves through the apocalyptic world. This is the missing link in our case that our member speech proves. But secondly, we bring you the extension, the principal extension on state obligation. That note, CO has failed to respond to. State obligation is relevant because this debate presupposes the existence of a governing body. The obligation to our citizens weighs over your obligation to protect the environment, because we have proved to you that your citizens will sustain massive casualties if you are susceptible to an apocalypse. Only on government can we protect ourselves, propose.
Thanks for that speech. Inviting OpVip to conclude the debate.
Am I both audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Hello?
Yes, you are.
Hello?
Can you
Am
hear
I?
me? Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I need to mute my partner's computer. Okay, verbal POIs. Let me set up my clock. Speech will start in 3, 2. If we survive after the apocalypse, it will be a world ruled by the strongest, most savage, most brutish people. A life hunting for scraps is not one worth living for all those reasons cited with CO. Firstly, let me deal with OG. And here their main push is about how climate change is inherently unsolvable. Firstly, I'm going to prove why it doesn't need to be, right? Because at least on our side, we get to mitigate apocalypse. This means we get more time. GovBench needs to take this trade-off because we at least have the marginal ability to get more time, right? Like a couple of years, 5 or 6 more years. While OO did say this, where we will now uniquely impact this. Because Jaden already brings you the biggest impacts of this debate. He explains to you why life is terrible in the apocalypse, right? Because of the sick mechanisms he gives you. This means that if we get more people time in a normal world where they're able to enjoy life, where you're able to go to school, where you're able to come back and have a good dinner with your parents, not worrying about which animal you have to hunt down and kill or which person you have to rob, this is already a massive impact, and this is sufficient impact for us to already win this debate. Gov needs to prove why survival is not just good, but why it's good to survive beyond just having food to eat. Secondly, also note that apocalypse preparedness on SideGov is likely to only be for the rich. Why is this? Given that government thinks that the way this apocalypse preparedness is going to look like is things like building artificial habitats, which is very hard to build and it's also limited in size, or bunkers, which are limited in quality because you can have a very good bunker that's 10 stories down, or you could have a crappy one that's only a metal shield or whatever. This means that the best types of apocalypse preparedness is only going to be for the rich, because note that the rich is a uniquely more powerful voter base. These are the people that are most likely to donate to campaigns. These are the people who are most likely to go to the voting polls, right? Because they're the most engaged in politics. They're the most educated, and meaning that they will be more likely to actually go and support one party. So governments already have an incentive to satisfy them the most. B, on why governments may act irrationally in this situation. Because given that government bench paints the situation as so devastating, right? That the world is going to implode on itself. Governments have an active incentive to build this infrastructure around them. Because we are taking this in Gov's best case scenario, where the apocalypse is very urgent and everybody cares about it. Governments have the short-term incentive to make sure that themselves are as safe as possible, that their family at home are as safe as possible. This means they're likely to do things like building these structures in more affluent areas. On their side, good bunkers are in rich areas, around rich neighborhoods. There's going to be this one mega bunker that can sustain life for the next 100 years. There will also be more stores of foods and crops. There'll be a large amount of stockpile with security guards guarding it, make sure that no one steals from it, right? And on the poor neighborhood, there's going to be nothing for them. There's going to be very limited resources, and these people are going to be left to die anyways. The comparative on our side is that climate change climate conservation benefits everybody, i.e., the rich can't decide where climate conservation goes to. Like, once you reduce carbon emissions, everyone benefits from carbon emissions. We just weigh on vulnerability because we're the only side that can benefit the most like vulnerable, poor people in this situation who are unlikely to benefit from any sort of apocalypse preparedness. Now, moving on to OO. OO states that I'm going to weigh them out here. OO states that climate change is solvable, and to a certain extent I agree with CG. There's like a deadlock in opening health, like they can't prove whether it's solvable or unsolvable. But Jaden proves to you a much more certain impact on likelihood about why it helps people now. I.e., there's a lot of positive externalities on focusing the climate like conservation, where you offer more jobs to people, more people can get income. You offer green energy that helps people health because now like you don't need to breathe in as much pollutants as before. This is the only unspeculative point in this debate. This is already a certain impact that we get, and you should value this the most at the end of the day. Lastly, note that only Jaden works with the worst case scenario in this debate about why life after apocalypse is not worth living. OO does not work with this beyond their one-liner. Only Jaden mechanizes and impacts this. This means that even in government's best case scenario, where they save everybody, there's nowhere to go, right? You'll be living in a wasteland where we are simply reduced to simply living for the sake of survival. Every day, you're not doing anything for happiness. Every day, all you're doing like is robbing people and like hunting for water like 12 hours a day. This is not a life worth living. This is very important. Now, moving on to CG. Lastly, CG. Firstly, I'm gonna like reconstruct Love Jaden's points. On his point about life after apocalypse, Gov Whips states that one, we can stockpile materials. Well, this is untrue. Like, this is going to be temporary, and based on like this stockpile is going to be temporary, right? Like, it's going to be based on how long this will last, meaning that even sure you have a stockpile for a month, eventually you have to go out and start hunting for food on your own. You'll start to have to kill people to get food because there's not enough resources. Also, note that Jaden's 6 mechanism is very important, because even if I had enough food for like a month, even if I could be munching down on like SpaghettiOs and like drinking water, it doesn't matter because it's not as good as before, where I could like have, I don't know, food, like access to food like pasta or steak and like actually good food that I will enjoy. Secondly, they state that people will be able to collaborate. This is untrue because there's not enough resources for a large group, meaning that people are unable to group together and you'll have to fight for resources. Secondly, authoritarianism will occur, because note that it is the best way to increase efficiency of resources, because decisions can be made quickly, so like you can like act quickly and make sure that you have enough resources for everybody. This is why the farther back we go in history, the closer we get to survival, the more authoritarian the world is. This is why in the Roman era, it wasn't that like you could still vote for people, right? Because it wasn't that authoritarian. But like in the Middle Ages, it was very authoritarian. Their material on why the moving on to like points of rebuttal to them. Their material on why the apocalypse is likely to happen is mainly derivative OG. Now I'm going to deal with 2 pieces of unique material from them. Firstly, about why apocalypse preparedness is going to be done effectively. I think they run into the many problems similar with OG, right? Why are people likely to be committed? It's unlikely that they will be committed because, it's also very approximate to them. Climate conversation occurs because, one, people do care. School systems already teach us that climate change is very important. It's ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist. Giving up on the climate and focusing on preparedness is likely to be unpopular and a signal that you're already cooked. Why is the climate apocalypse preparation isn't going to be done as good as it's done in the past, in the COVID pandemic or in Japan, right? Because firstly, Japan had to experience it first, right? They had to see their whole city collapse in an earthquake and get nuked before they actually put in effort into it. And also on the Soviet Union, they cared about the Soviet Union because it was a tangible opposition. Their short point about how the state has an obligation to help humans is simply symmetric. On both sides, we want to help humanity. For all those reasons, side CO. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech and everybody for the great semi-final. Teams can cross the floor over. You'll get the verdict of the round, I think, in the main call. Thanks, everyone. Judges, let's probably move to room 1A for the deliberation.